What if I told you your body has been quietly holding a conversation with the universe ever since you were born, and most of the time you barely notice? Cosmology Sleepy unveils how your body connects you to the world is not an extravagant claim, it is an invitation to slow down, to listen, and to recognize the everyday, intimate ways your senses stitch you into place. Tonight, we will walk through that quiet architecture together, like two people side by side in a dim room, following the faint light of a single lamp. If you enjoy calm science by the bedside, a like and a subscription helps keep these quiet journeys going. And if you feel like it, leave a small note in the comments telling me where you're listening from, your town or your time zone. It makes this feel less like a monologue and more like a neighborhood. We learn early that humans have 5 senses. It's a neat teaching tool: sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch. Aristotle put that list into a philosophical frame that lasted centuries, and it still has value. But the world inside and around us is far richer than that neat 5-fold poster. Modern physiology and neuroscience prefer not to stop at 5. They describe a chorus of senses, some obvious, some hidden, each a musician in the orchestra of perception. Aristotle's neat row of senses made sense in his time because it mapped to what we can easily perceive at a glance. Yet even he used the word senses in flexible ways. It's worth pausing on that historical moment, not to correct the great philosopher, but to notice how our language shapes what we see. For many people, the 5-sense list is an anchor. For scientists, it's the first verse of a longer song. Think of the senses as a symphony rather than individual soloists. The orchestra has strings and winds, but it also has a percussion section, a subtle choir of overtones, an offstage glockenspiel you only hear in certain passages. The brain is a conductor, listening and cueing, dampening one section while lifting another. What we call seeing or tasting is not a single instrument, but a whole ensemble playing together. Over the next hours, or nights if you prefer, I'll introduce many of those instruments, sometimes by name, sometimes by feeling. For each, I will offer an anecdote, a gentle explanation of how the parts work, and a small descriptive invitation to notice what that sense does for you. Let's begin with vision. It is the loudest instrument in our cultural orchestra, the one often assumed to carry the most truth about the world. We think of eyes as cameras. Light enters, an image forms, and we observe. The analogy is useful, but it can also hide the fact that much of seeing is interpretation. Picture this. It's late, you wake, and there's a small familiar panic as your hand searches for the bedside lamp. Your fingers meet the cool metal, you click the switch, and the room blooms. That bloom is not an exact copy of the outside world arriving in your skull. It is a recreation, assembled from light patterns, prior expectations, and a long ledger of past experiences. Start with the hardware. Light first meets the eye at the transparent cornea, an outer window that bends and focuses light. The pupil, the round dark aperture in the center, adjusts like an automatic aperture on a camera, widening to let in more light when it's dim, narrowing when it's bright. The crystalline lens behind the pupil fine-tunes focus, changing shape to cast a sharp pattern onto the retina at the back of your eye. The retina itself is an astonishing patchwork. Photoreceptor cells, rods and cones, sit like tiny microphones, each tuned to particular kinds of light. Rods are sensitive to low light. They let you navigate a moonlit path. Cones are concentrated toward the center of the retina and are responsible for color and fine detail. Among tones, we often name 3 types, roughly corresponding to sensitivity to longer, medium, and shorter wavelengths, a shorthand for red, green, and blue. In some people, a 4th cone type gives a subtly expanded palette. Tetrachromacy is rare but real in certain individuals, and it suggests how even seemingly fixed senses can vary between us. Photons striking these receptors are transformed into electrical signals. These signals travel along the optic nerve and stop at a relay station in the brain called the lateral geniculate nucleus before being passed on to the visual cortex. There, the information is processed across layers and regions, each tuned to edges, motion, color, depth, or combinations of these. Vision is a distributed operation. No single pixel represents the world, rather patterns of activity together produce the percept. There are fascinating quirks in this machinery. Take the blind spot, for example.
Where the optic nerve leaves the eye, there are no photoreceptors, and so a tiny patch of the visual field is literally without input. Yet you rarely notice a hole in your sight because the brain fills in missing information using the surrounding texture and expectations. Or consider the inverted retinal image. The image projected on the retina is upside down, and yet your experience of the world is upright. The brain learned to map those inputs to the stable orientation we recognize. Orientation emerges from processing, not from the raw projection itself. Beyond these anatomical notes are deeper surprises. Some people with damage to the primary visual cortex can't consciously see images, yet they can reliably respond to visual stimuli, catching a moving object or guessing the orientation of a line at above chance levels. This phenomenon, called blind sight, suggests that visual processing happens in parallel streams. Some underpin conscious experience, others guide behavior without entering awareness.
It's a subtle reminder that perception and action can be decoupled, and that seeing is not a single simple thing. Vision's dominance in our culture has another effect. When it is absent or diminished, other senses can step forward in remarkable ways. Blind echolocation is one example. People born blind and some who lose sight later in life can learn to produce sharp mouth clicks and listen to the echoes. Over time, they map those returning sounds onto spatial layouts. In some neural imaging studies, parts of the occipital cortex, typically visual territory, become active during echolocation. The cortex does not rigidly belong to one sense. In many cases, it is willing to learn a new instrument. If you'd like a quiet moment right now, imagine the bedside lamp scene again, but with your eyes closed. Picture the expanse of your room as a texture, not a picture. The coolness of a sheet, the gentle rise of a book on the nightstand, the soft weight of a duvet at your ankles. This is not an exercise to fix any deficiency. It's simply a way to notice how much your sight scaffolds the rest of your sensations. How does the memory of the lamp's placement feel differently when you lose the visual cue? You might notice a small narrowing of certainty, a different kind of attention settling in. Now, move with me toward hearing, another primary instrument in our sensory orchestra, but one that behaves quite differently to vision. While sight often gives us a spatial map, where things are, hearing gives us a temporal map, when things happen and how they change over time. Sounds arrive, swell, decay, and change, and our auditory system is exquisitely tuned to timing. Imagine a rainy night. The window is a soft percussion, 1,000 small rhythms across the panes. You strain at first and then relax. There is a soothing pattern. Sound is air pressure in motion. The outer ear collects these pressure fluctuations and funnels them down the ear canal to vibrate the eardrum. Those vibrations are passed through the tiny bones of the middle ear, the ossicles, which act like a delicate lever, amplifying the motion and sending it to the fluid-filled inner ear, the cochlea. The cochlea is spiral-shaped, and along its length sit rows of hair cells. These hair cells transduce mechanical vibrations into electrical signals. Different parts of the cochlea respond to different frequencies, high frequencies near the base, lower ones toward the apex. That spatial mapping of frequency, called tonotopy, is preserved up the auditory pathway into the brain. In the auditory cortex, neurons respond to combinations of pitches and temporal patterns, building the rich textures we recognize as speech, music, machinery, footsteps. Hearing is especially good at localization. Even with identical ears and a simple head, tiny differences in arrival time and intensity between your ears let you judge where a sound comes from.
That's how you can tell whether the kettle is behind you to the left or the rain is heavy on the street outside. But localization is not infallible. The brain uses multiple cues and can be fooled by echoes or by sounds that are similar in different parts of the spectrum. The cocktail party effect is a delightful example. Despite noise and overlap, we can tune in to one voice in a crowded room, following its rhythm and timbre as if our ears had social preferences. Sound touches the emotional centers of the brain in curious ways. The olfactory system's intimacy with the limbic brain is well known for emotional memory, but audition too interfaces gracefully with feeling. A minor chord can feel wistful, a major chord bright, a familiar voice can soothe instantaneously. Music exploits this by combining rhythm, pitch, and timbre to craft expectation and release, an operation the auditory brain loves. Here is a small vignette you might enjoy rehearsing in your mind. Imagine waking before dawn and hearing a single, clear tap on a window, perhaps the wingtip of a small bird, or a loose slat nudged by wind. The sound is brief, high frequency, and your brain registers it first as an event in time. Even before you open your eyes, it has offered a kind of weather report. There is movement outside, the night is not completely still. That temporal immediacy is hearing's gift. Hearing also shows us how the brain fills in gaps. In noisy environments, the brain can interpolate missing syllables or rely on lip reading to complete speech. It is a predictive mechanism at work. The auditory system continuously generates expectations about forthcoming sound patterns, and when the input deviates, it updates those predictions. Later, when we discuss predictive processing more explicitly, hearing will be one of our principal examples. There are technological and adaptive stories here too. Cochlear implants, for instance, provide an electrical stimulation to the auditory nerve for people with certain kinds of hearing loss. They do not fully replicate the acoustic richness of natural hearing, but they provide cues that the brain can learn to use, restoring access to speech and environmental sounds for many recipients. It is an illustration of neuroplasticity. Given new patterns of input, the nervous system finds ways to interpret them. I'll return to such examples in more detail when we explore adaptation and sensory substitution. If you pause now and let attention soften, you might notice the small background sounds of where you are, the hum of a fridge, the distant city traffic, perhaps the quiet turn of your breathing. None of these demands action, yet they shape the texture of this moment. Hear how those sounds make the room feel larger or smaller. Notice whether any of them tug at a memory. Hearing is not only directional, it is temporal and mnemonic.
Before we step away from audition, there is a curious phenomenon worth mentioning: the way small differences in training and culture can dramatically alter auditory acuity. Musicians, for example, commonly show refined pitch discrimination, timing precision, and auditory working memory. Athletes and dancers may develop an enhanced sensitivity to rhythmic cues that synchronize movement. Such specializations are examples of use-dependent plasticity. The brain sharpens the circuits it frequently calls upon, sculpting the orchestra to the tasks most often asked of it. We have now met two prominent sections of the sensory orchestra: vision with its rich spatial mapping and interpretive machinery, and hearing with its temporal acuity and emotional resonance. Each handily illustrates a recurring theme. Perception is not a passive receipt of data, but an active, constructive process. The brain predicts, edits, and integrates. A small sidebar is worth floating here: a paraphrased exchange I had, in my mind, with a colleague in auditory neuroscience. She reminded me, gently, that while we sometimes speak as if perception is like reading off a temperature, it is better thought of as continual hypothesis testing. The brain is forever asking, what is most likely to have caused this pattern of input, she said. That modest formulation explains why illusions can be so revealing. They are moments when the brain's best guess differs from the external physics of the stimulus. They are little creases in the fabric of perception, and when we look closely at those creases, we learn about the tailoring. And that brings us to an important methodological note. Whenever I describe a sensory mechanism as if it were a tidy machine, remember that it's a living system. Biological components have variability, histories, and quirks. Research indicates general principles, but individual experience can be delightfully idiosyncratic. Some people hear or see or taste with subtle differences that are poorly captured by broad categories. That variability is not an error. It is part of the species' repertoire for adapting to diverse environments. We have lingered in enough detail on sight and sound for one stretch. The next chapters will gather scent and flavor, touch and skin-based sensing, and then dive into the hidden senses that quietly keep your balance, tell you where your limbs are, and monitor the state of your internal organs. If you look back at the orchestra metaphor, you will notice the score gets denser from here. Scent and taste are intimate, time and temperature sit in the rhythm section, and interoception is the basis that keeps the heartbeat steady. Before I turn the page, here is a slightly extended vignette to bring both sight and sound together, a small scene you can hold in your mind like a stone in the palm. Imagine a quiet morning on a small train, the carriage half empty.
Outside, the light is soft and silver. Inside, the upholstery is a muted green. A woman across the aisle lifts a paper cup, the soft crinkle of cardboard as she shifts her hands, the sudden sparkle of sunlight on a ring she wears. Your eyes catch the ring. Your ears catch the whisper of paper. In an instant, an entire backstory is suggested, not by any single sense, but by the mingling of many. Perhaps she is heading to a rehearsal, or perhaps to a market, or perhaps neither. The brain composes these hints into a sketch, a probable narrative. You may not know the truth, but you are already connected to that other person in a small social way. That is the social life of sensing. It is how we enter into other people's worlds without intrusive certainty, how we imagine, infer, and share.
Taste buds on the tongue detect sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami, plus perhaps a few others debated by scientists. But texture, temperature, and retronasal odor make the meal recognizably, joyfully whole. This is why when you have a cold, food often seems bland. The retronasal pathway is muffled. There are delightful human differences here. Supertasters, a colloquial term with some scientific support, have a higher density of certain taste receptors and papillae, making bitter compounds, for instance, more intense. Cultural exposure shapes flavor preferences too. What tastes pungent to one child may taste comforting to another who grew up with those spices. Taste and smell are therefore simultaneously biological and cultural. They are personal palettes painted by genes, experience, and habit. If you like a small contemplative vignette, picture yourself sitting near a window with a cup of tea. You lift the cup, steam rises and carries subtle bouquets of tannin, perhaps a citrus note. You draw the cup nearer and, without deciding to, breathe in through your nose as the steam reaches the roof of the mouth. For a moment, focus on how flavor seems to arrive from a place both inside and outside, a miniature exchange between the world's vapor and your inner memory stores. There is no requirement to do anything. Simply noticing the arrival of those layered sensations can make you aware of how your body assembles a rich experience from small, local cues. Science has some charming stories about smell. In the 19th century, chemists and perfumers were locked in an armchair and laboratory relationship. Perfumers learned to dissect odor into component notes by patient comparison, while chemists isolated volatile compounds. More modern olfactory research has explored how the brain represents scents. Some scientists argue for a combinatorial code, in which unique mixtures of receptor activations signal particular odors, rather like chords of notes signaling a melody. Others look at how context shapes interpretation. The same molecular pattern can be pleasant or aversive, depending on past associations. There is also caution. Olfactory research is still uncovering how much of our odor-driven behavior is automatic versus learned. Claims that specific odors can reliably change complex behaviors in humans, beyond momentary mood shifts, are often overstated. The evidence tends to suggest influence rather than control. Similarly, stories about universal human pheromones remain speculative. Some animals use chemical signals in rigid, evolution-shaped ways, but human social chemistry is messier and more context-sensitive. Taste and smell connect closely to memory and identity. They are, in a way, the most autobiographical of senses. One small side note worth mentioning: the loss or distortion of smell, anosmia or parosmia, can be profoundly disorienting for some people, affecting appetite and emotional well-being.
There are many causes and varied prognoses. The literature points to a range of outcomes and cautious optimism in some recovery cases, but it is important not to make promises. If smell has been altered for you, know that researchers and clinicians are paying close attention, and some approaches to rehabilitation exist, but they are clinical conversations, not simple remedies. Let us move the hand from the teacup to something you touch. The skin is not merely a protective bag, it is a listening organ, an immense canvas of receptors. Touch is not one sensation, but many. There are receptors that register steady pressure, those that detect fluttering stroking, others that perceive fast vibrations, and still others that signal stretch or the feeling of a hair moved by air. Below the surface, free nerve endings warn of tissue damage, the raw dimension of pain, while specialized cold and warm receptors sample temperature. A brief look at receptors. Merkel cells, near the skin surface, give you fine spatial detail, the ability to read Braille-like textures. Meissner's corpuscles respond to light touch and low-frequency vibration, useful for grip and detecting slip. Pacinian corpuscles are tuned to high-frequency vibration and sudden pressure changes. Together, they feed information about the world's textures, shapes, and movements into spinal and brain circuits. But touch is also social. Slow, gentle stroking at particular speeds engages a class of nerve fibers called C-tactile afferents, which are especially linked to pleasant touch and social bonding. That touch pathway connects to areas of the brain that register affect, showing how a hand on the shoulder can be physiologically calming beyond mere physical contact. Developmentally, touch is foundational. Babies born prematurely, for example, often benefit from gentle massage and skin-to-skin contact with a caregiver. These interactions can stabilize heart rate, breathing, and temperature, and seem to facilitate early social bonding.
The science here is careful. It does not promise a single technique cures developmental risk, but it shows that bodily contact is entangled with emotional regulation from early life. There is also an interplay between touch and skill. A skilled craftsman, a pianist, a sculptor, all these people have heightened tactile discrimination in their hands. That arises from repetitive, attentive practice. The brain magnifies the territory devoted to sensitive skin and controlling muscles, refining the orchestra's string section for detailed work. Sensory training reshapes cortical maps. The musician's touch is in part a learned amplification. I must mention pain because it is part of the tactile family, and because it is both biological warning and subjective experience. Nociceptors signal actual or potential tissue damage. They are not a simple pain meter, but complex detectors modulated by context, expectation, and previous experience.
This is why the same stimulus can be excruciating in one person and manageable in another. Discussions of pain require sensitivity and scientific nuance. Research offers models and therapeutic pathways, but it also recognizes the limits of our understanding of subjective suffering. I will not present pain as something to be quickly fixed. Instead, it is part of the sensing landscape we inhabit and must respect. If you like, hold the image of soft rain again and picture the skin's response, a coolness on exposed forearms, the fine prickle as droplets meet wool. You will notice that temperature and texture, along with the auditory rhythm of the rain, produce a composed impression of being in that place. Touch is extraordinarily good at giving a sense of immediate presence. Now, perhaps the most intriguing section of our orchestra, the hidden senses. These are the players we rarely learn about in school, but who quietly keep the music steady. First among them is the vestibular system, the organ of balance seated within your inner ears. It contains semicircular canals and two otolith organs. The semicircular canals detect rotational accelerations. When you spin, the fluid inside the canals lags, bending hair cells and signaling rotation. The otoliths detect linear accelerations and gravity. They inform you which way is down and whether you are accelerating forward on a bus. Together, they orient your body in space, support stable vision during movement, and coordinate reflexes that keep you upright. The vestibular system has an odd conversational style with the rest of the senses. When you turn your head rapidly, your eyes make tiny compensatory movements, the vestibulo-ocular reflex, so the world appears stable. When those signals mismatch, for example when you are in a sailing boat and your inner ear says motion, but your eyes tell a stationary cabin, nausea can result. Seasickness is a classic mismatch condition, a sign that sensory integration sometimes falters. Proprioception is the sense of where your body parts are without looking. Muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, and joint receptors report stretch and tension, offering the nervous system a continuous stream of positional data. Close your eyes now, not that you have to, and imagine touching your nose. Most people can do this effortlessly because proprioception provides precise limb position information. Proprioceptive loss, as in the fascinating and poignant case of Ian Waterman, reveals how critical this sense is. After a viral illness destroyed his large fiber sensory neurons decades ago, Ian lost proprioception below the neck. He could not feel where his limbs were and had to use visual attention to control movements. With enormous perseverance, he learned to walk again by watching his legs and using careful planning.
His story is a testament to human resilience and to the brain's capacity for compensatory strategies. When one instrument fails, others with enough training can take on new roles. Interoception is the label for sensing the internal state of the body: hunger, thirst, heart rate, respiration, visceral discomfort. It is less about locating an external object and more about reporting how you are doing inside. Interoceptive signals travel to the insular cortex, among other regions, and contribute to feelings, motivation, and self-awareness. People vary widely in interoceptive sensitivity. Some sense every flutter of the heart. Others live with a steadier interior background. Interoception links to emotion. Bodily cues contribute to the way feelings are experienced and interpreted. Thermoception and nociception have been quietly introduced already. They are essential regulators. The skin's temperature receptors detect tiny differences and guide behavioral responses, seeking warmth, withdrawing from cold, while nociceptors raise alarms. Both systems interact with physiology. A fever alters thermoception, inflammation sensitizes nociceptive pathways, and chronic pain can reconfigure the nervous system in ways researchers are still trying to understand. Chronoception, our sense of time, is less of a single organ and more of a distributed cognitive faculty. We can track milliseconds in music, hours in a workday, and years across a life, but there is no simple time receptor in the body. Instead, perceived time depends on attention, expectation, arousal, and neural dynamics across wide circuits. Certain drugs and emotional states stretch or compress subjective time, and research indicates that predictable rhythms help the brain form temporal predictions. Our sense of time is therefore an emergent property of neural processing rather than a straightforward sensory channel. There is also a speculative whisper in the literature about magnetoreception in humans. Some migratory birds, fish, and even bacteria detect the Earth's magnetic field via specialized molecules or magnetite crystals in tissue. For humans, the evidence is tentative. A few studies have reported subtle behavioral or neural responses to magnetic stimuli, but replication is sparse and interpretations contested. So it remains an intriguing possibility rather than established fact, a future movement in the orchestra that we can only listen for carefully. All these hidden senses contribute to a stable, coordinated life. Think of standing in a dark kitchen. You rely on vestibular and proprioceptive cues to avoid colliding with a countertop. Interoceptive signals might tell you are thirsty. Thermoception tells which cup is hot. The brain weaves these threads into an action-ready fabric. That weaving is where we meet predictive processing. Predictive processing is a framework that many neuroscientists find useful.
The basic idea is that the brain does not passively receive sense data, but constantly generates expectations about what will occur and updates those expectations when errors arise. Input is compared to prediction. Mismatches drive learning and attention. In music, for instance, a melody sets up an expectation. An unexpected chord creates surprise, which the brain registers and either integrates or stores as novelty. In perception, the brain's models shape raw input into coherent experiences. When predictions are strong, ambiguous input is rapidly interpreted in line with expectation. This approach helps explain illusions. If the brain strongly predicts a straight line based on context, it may see that line even when portions are missing. It also explains robust phenomena like the McGurk effect, where visual lip movements influence what we hear. The brain integrates multiple sensory channels to arrive at a single best guess. The predictive brain is an active editor, constantly smoothing and revising the sensory manuscript. Multisensory integration is a field rich with experiments that show how senses combine. Ventriloquism is a neat example. When a puppet's moving mouth is synchronized with a voice coming from a different place, we attribute the voice to the puppet. The brain privileges temporal and spatial coincidence to bind stimuli into a coherent source. The rubber hand illusion offers another curious demonstration. Synchronous stroking of a hidden real hand and a visible fake hand can produce a compelling sense that the fake hand is part of one's body. These experiments reveal flexible boundaries of selfhood. The brain's body map is malleable under certain conditions. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to change with experience, is central to how integration and compensation occur. When one sense is lost, cortical territories can be co-opted. In some blind people, visual cortex becomes responsive to touch or sound. Cochlear implant recipients exhibit adult plasticity as the brain learns to interpret electrical patterns as sound, especially when implanted earlier in life. Sensory substitution devices exploit this plasticity. A camera's visual data can be translated into tactile stimulation on the back or tongue, and with practice, users learn to read scenes through touch. These technologies do not magically restore native perception, but they show how adaptable the system is. I shall paraphrase a neuroscientist I once read. She described the brain as a prediction factory that inventories incoming signals and weighs them against models built from past experience. When models are robust, perception is efficient and stable. When they are wrong, the error signals foster revision. The gentle take-home is that perception is an iterative dialogue, not a one-way translation. Case stories illuminate these principles. Ian Waterman's persistence and adaptation have already been noted.
Another vivid example is that of people who, blind from an early age, develop echolocation skills. By making small clicking sounds and listening to echoes, they perceive spatial layouts with notable accuracy. Functional imaging shows activation in occipital regions during echolocation, suggesting that visual cortex can process auditory spatial information.
This is not to suggest a perfect substitution. Rather, it is evidence of the cortex's willingness to repurpose itself for useful tasks when guided by experience. Technologies showcase adaptation too. Cochlear implants have given many people access to speech and environmental sounds, though outcomes vary and the devices have limitations in complex listening environments like crowded rooms. Prosthetic limbs with sensory feedback, where pressure sensors translate into tactile or electrical signals, are an area of active development. Some users report that intuitive control improves when the limb provides even crude feedback about contact or force. Research remains cautious. The aesthetics of sensation, the fidelity of signals, and the subjective sense of embodiment matter as much as the technical specifications. I will offer a short reflective vignette about integration. Imagine lying on a hill watching stars. The sky is a cool, dark velvet. A moth brushes your cheek once, barely there. Your breath is a rhythmic rise. Somewhere below, distant traffic hums. No single sense owns the moment. Your vision composes the vastness. Touch assures you of your body. Audition places the hum at some remove. Interoception registers the rise of your chest. The brain knits these threads into being here under stars. If you were to remove one thread, the character of the scene would change, but the whole would persist because of the ensemble. This is the quiet power at play in daily life. Let us turn briefly to speculative frontiers. As I mentioned earlier, magnetoreception is robustly present in many animals. Some fish and birds navigate using subtle magnetic cues. In humans, experiments seeking clear behavioral evidence have produced mixed results. A small number of studies report orientation biases under controlled magnetic fields, while others find no consistent effect. Some work suggest the presence of magnetite or compass-like proteins in human tissue, but the function and behavioral relevance remain unresolved. The proper posture here is curiosity and caution. It is a field to watch, not a finished story. Chronoception is another intriguing frontier. Psychological time is shaped by attention, emotion, and rhythm. When you are engaged in a flow activity, hours can slip by like seconds. Under threat, moments expand. Neural correlates involve dopamine systems, timing circuits in the basal ganglia, and cortical dynamics. There is no single clock, but many timing mechanisms coordinated for different scales, milliseconds for motor control and circadian systems for daily rhythms.
Research into subjective time explores these multiple scales and how states like fatigue, boredom, or excitement alter perceived duration. If you enjoy small methodological sidebars, experiments that probe human magnetoreception often use shielded rooms and carefully controlled magnetic fields, but replicability and participant variability complicate firm conclusions. Timing studies use precise tasks and neuroimaging to infer correlates, yet they also remind us that human reports of time are deeply colored by attention and context. Both areas remain rich with questions rather than settled answers. Loss and adaptation deserve a deeper, respectful look. Sensory loss is not merely a missing faculty, it intersects with identity, practical navigation, and social life. People who lose vision often develop enhanced abilities in other modalities, but these compensations are not simple upgrades. They demand learning, time, and often systemic support. Rehabilitation services, assistive technology, and community networks matter profoundly. I will paraphrase a sensory therapist I spoke with in the imagination of my profession. She emphasized that recovery or adaptation is rarely linear. Small wins accumulate, learning to use a cane effectively, gaining confidence with echolocation clicks, discovering a prosthetic's feedback parameters that feel meaningful. Therapists often work to scaffold attention, provide graded tasks, and create environments where patients can experiment safely. The tone is of patient craftsmanship, not quick fixes. Technology can be empowering. Cochlear implants, as mentioned, have transformed many lives, particularly when implantation occurs early. Haptic devices translate visual data into skin patterns. For some users, these systems enable novel ways of orienting and recognizing objects. Yet technology also raises ethical and access questions. Devices can be expensive, outcomes variable, and cultural acceptance diverse. Communities sometimes debate whether prosthetic enhancements should aim to normalize or to provide different, valued capacities. These are not merely technical problems, but social and human ones. Let us linger on one extended anecdote that brings together loss, adaptation, and neuroplasticity. Imagine a woman named Aisha, a fictional composition inspired by many real stories. In her 30s, she gradually lost hearing due to an autoimmune process. For a while, she described her world as fading to muffled watercolor. With an implant and a supportive auditory training program, she relearned to parse speech and to enjoy music again, though music sounded different at first, a simpler palette with piercing clarity in certain pitches and a softness in others.
She found that visual cues and context helped enormously. Lip reading, rhythm, and familiarity guided her.
Over months, neural circuits adjusted, and Aisha reported a renewed sense of participation. Telephone calls became manageable, conversations regained texture, and she relearned the social rhythms of laughter and timing. The story is an example. Devices coupled with training and social supports can open pathways, but the process is gradual and personal. A second vignette. Tom, born blind, practices echolocation. He clicks his tongue, listens to echoes, and has learned to map interior spaces with surprising acuity. His cortical imaging shows occipital activation during echolocation tasks, reaffirming the brain's flexibility. Tom does not see the city in the way sighted people do, but he inhabits it robustly, guiding a bike, avoiding obstacles, and navigating crowds. His experience challenges common assumptions about sensory deficit and enriches our understanding of perceptual diversity. These stories also remind us of care. When discussing interventions and devices, it is important to acknowledge access disparities, cultural differences, and personal preference. Not everyone chooses the same path. Many communities value distinct sensory identities. The narrative we offer ought to be plural and humble. As we approach a gentle conclusion, let us return to the title's cosmic whisper, Cosmology Sleepy, how your body connects you to the world. If cosmology suggests the vastness of space, then let us use that image sparingly and lovingly. Your senses are threads linking a humming, local cosmos, the room, the city, the body, to something larger. In a stargazing moment, the light that reaches your eyes began its journey long before you were born. Similarly, the molecules that arouse your smell, the pressure waves that carry a friend's voice, the temperature gradients that kiss your face, each is part of a chain stretching outward in time and space. Here is a longer noticing vignette, not an instruction, but an invitation to imagine. Picture yourself on a clear night, lying back on cool grass. The sky is a pale scatter of stars. Your breath is slow. In the distance, a single car hums along a road. Above you, the cosmos shows its remoteness, a hush of far light. Yet your senses make that immensity intimate. Your vision traces a bright star, touch tracks the slight dampness of the ground, audition situates the car, interoception notes a calm heart. You are both infinitesimally small and richly connected. The atoms of your body were forged in ancient stars, and tonight their arrangements are carrying the story of a person noticing a sky. There is a gentle satisfaction in that double belonging, local and cosmic at once. The quiet scientist in me wishes to underline humility. Our sensory systems are brilliant and fallible, tuned by evolution and individual history. They inform us, warn us, and sometimes mislead us. They build a living world, a reconstructed reality that is always a collaboration between external signals and internal models.
Treating perception as an act, something the brain does, helps explain both our shared experiences and our private differences. Before we close, one more small practical reflection. That is not a prescriptive exercise, but an observation. Certain attentional postures enhance awareness. When you soften your expectations and allow sensation to be simply what it is, the orchestra can be heard more distinctly. This is not a remedy. It is a way of listening to the ordinary machinery of being. You might notice, for instance, how a single held breath or a remembered melody can change the layering of sensation in a moment. And now, as night deepens in many places and mornings stir elsewhere, let us tie a bow around the exploration. We began with Aristotle's 5 and expanded into a chorus of modalities: vision's interpretive maps, hearing's temporal textures, smell and taste's intimate choreography, touch's social and technical textures, the hidden senses, vestibular steadiness, proprioceptive knowing, interoceptive bookkeeping, thermoception's temperature book, and nociception's cautious alarms, chronoception's elastic time, and the tentative possibility of magnetoreception. We saw how the brain acts as conductor and editor, continually predicting and correcting, that neuroplasticity allows reassignments and reinventions, and that human stories of loss and adaptation teach patience and ingenuity. If you are moved to share one small thing before we part, I would be delighted to read where you are listening from.
your town, or your time zone in the comments. It helps make these bedside conversations into a modestly global neighborhood. And if this slow tour felt like a kind companion, a subscription is a tiny way to keep these quiet journeys going. I offer it as a soft footprint, not a demand. Finally, there is a simple blessing I like to leave in the late-night air. May your senses, in their many voices, keep you safely present. May their music remind you that you are connected to place, to people, and, in a small way, to the cosmos' patient light. Good night, and thank you for listening.